first off, we have your standard flat collar that either has a plastic snap or a metal buckle. They are usually made out of nylon, synthetic nylon, or leather. A high quality leather one I will always advocate for because they should last for the lifetime of the handler. Not the lifetime of the dog, but quality leather goods should last for the lifetime of the handler. In other words, the collar should outlive the dog. But if you have an aversion to leather for whatever reason, if you're a vegan or something, there are some good synthetic products out there. A flat collar is typically used to hold the tags for your dog, to attach a leash to your dog. You can do some basic corrections and guiding and applying leash pressure, things like that with the flat collar. They come in just about every shape and size and color that you can imagine. Glow-in-the-dark, neon, studded, spikes. Really everything has been done with a flat collar. It's the most basic collar, it's the most common, pretty solid foundation. The next thing you see a lot of is a metal choke chain, which is a long chain of tightly wound, small linked metal with a small loop on one end, and it loops through and makes a slip knot. And there's usually a larger loop on the other end that acts as a stopper so that the collar can only extend so far and does not come back over the dog's head. Now I'm showing how this works on a slip lead because I do not own a choke chain. I will always tell people to not own or use choke chains. I will say again that they are any collar or any leash or tool is just that, is a tool that serves a function and a purpose. And any tool can be used correctly. It can also be misused and abused. So my biggest aversion to choke chains and even slip leads like this to the same extent is that a dog can hurt themselves on it, and pretty easily, particularly with big, strong, and high-driven dogs. And the reason for that is there is no stop to how far this will shrink down. So if you imagine your dog's head inside this hole, it is getting choked to death while it is pulling on this lead, trying to get at the thing at once, and you're trying to pull your dog back. So while this is around the dog's neck and you're pulling from behind it, the dog is pulling forward, and there's an incredible amount of frontal pressure on the windpipe and the vocal cords of the dog. That's why their breathing sounds labored and raspy. In other words, the dog doesn't sound like it's panting like normal, like it sounds very pressured, like because that's exactly what's happening. There's added pressure on the windpipe, and it's very easy for dogs to hurt themselves, especially when they hit the end of that line really quickly, like when they're chasing after something or a cat gives chase, and especially over time if they're constantly pulling and pulling and pulling. This sort of pressure also incites an opposition reflex in dogs. So the harder you pull on it, the harder they pull against it, and the more likely they are to cause injury to themselves. I don't advise using choke chains. Rather than using a choke chain, what I would recommend is the use of a prong collar. I know they look rather medieval, but they're actually a much safer alternative because as pressure is applied from the leash, there's a limit to how far this will shrink down. In other words, it won't get any smaller than this, versus a slip lead or a choke chain would just keep shrinking down, literally like would squeeze a dog's head off if enough force was applied. So how this pinch collar or prong collar works is just like the name implies. The prongs, when pressure is applied, pinch inwards, they flex inwards, and pinch the skin a little bit. And it doesn't particularly hurt, you just notice it. Put it on myself to demonstrate. And probably some of the things people need to look out for with these are sizing. and that is how tight it is around the dog's neck. You obviously don't want it to be poking and prodding your dog constantly, because then you're constantly giving the dog a correction, so it always feels like it's being punished, which is not what you want to do. You also don't want to have it too large in circumference, so too loose on the dog's neck, where the tips are just barely sitting on the neck. You're not really pinching anything, and the collar isn't really doing its job then. The other thing to look out for is placement on the dog's neck. So a dog's neck is wider at the base by the shoulders than it is up by the head. It's more narrow, where the skull connects to the neck. But that's actually where you want to place the pinch collar, is right behind the ears, where the skull meets the neck and the neck is narrow. So not down by the shoulders. The proper placement is up closer to the ears. The other thing to mention about pinch collars is the size of the links. So a lot of people mistakenly think that because they have a big dog, they need large links, but that's not true. You need more links to make a longer collar to go around a bigger dog's bigger neck. What smaller links do is they actually give a sharper correction. So this collar would give a rather mild correction versus something with links that are half the size of each link. Put another way, the smaller links give you more pinch per inch. That is, more of these flexing points and more pinches per inch around the neck. Something else you might see that I don't particularly own myself is a Martingale collar. And what that is essentially a hybrid of a flat collar and a prong collar. So it will have a buckle or a snap and a nylon strap that goes around the dog's neck, but the ends, it may have a snap on it. Those ones might break, so don't get those. It'll have a nylon strap, and that nylon strap will replace the pinching prongs on the prong collar, but the Martingale collar will still have a mechanism like this where there's a stopping point, but the collar can still shrink down and apply pressure around the dog's neck. The difference is there aren't prongs pinching the skin, rather it's just the nylon strap sliding down around the dog's neck, but again, there is a stopping point to it. I did forget to mention with the prong collars that they do tend to pop off. So the way you open the prong collar is by starting to pull out one of the prongs and pinching the shoulders of the link and pulling it out. Now, ironically and unfortunately, the time when a prong collar is most likely to come detached is the moment when you most need it. So that is when the dog pulls on the leash and thereby the collar suddenly. That's when pressure is most likely to have applied in a kinked position and pop the collar open. So it's important to always back these types of collars up. Leerburg sells a dominant dog collar. I may do a video in the future about how to do it yourself and rig something up with a slip lead as a backup collar for your dog, and attaching that to your regular leash. Something I've seen other trainers recommend is using a carabiner. I do not recommend that actually. I think it is a good idea in nature, but in practicality, it doesn't really work. My dog, Dean, is a 75-pound shepherd, and he has broken keychain carabiners at least doubled up. So if you have a strong, big dog, those keychain carabiners are simply not going to cut it, especially if the dog is driven to the point where it's detaching a prong collar. So don't use the keychain carabiners. Use a climb carabiner if you're going to do that, or use some other backup system like a slip lead. And like I said, I'll post a link to that so you can buy it, or I'll post a video in the future about backing it up and doing it yourself. The next type of collar you may see is an agitation collar, and this one is actually broken. The buckle is broken on it, but you can see that it's pretty much like a flat collar, but it is much thicker. So your regular flat collars depending on the size of the dog they're made for, are probably anywhere from ½ inch to 1 inch in width, versus this is a 2-inch agitation collar, and most that I've seen are either 1.5 inches to 2 inches. They have, some of them have padding on the inside, and many of them either come with or without a handle on the collar as well. And these are made for like biting or protection sports. So I mentioned before that the thing you want to look out for with other corrective collars, like a choke chain or a slip lead, is the pressure that it applies on the dog's neck. So if you imagine like a bigger, stronger dog is already going to apply a lot of pressure when it's pulling into something, especially if that something is smaller in width. There's a lot more pounds per square inch. So a agitation collar is fatter, more wide for that specific reason. So it spreads out that dog's strength and power when they're pushing into it, so that they're not going to damage their windpipe or their vocal cords or anything like that. Lastly, we have the e-collar, and there is a lot of misrepresentation about e-collars out there. This is probably the prime example of a good tool being misused and abused frequently. This one is made by Dogtra. Comes with a remote. I think this particular model has a half-mile range. It is made for one dog. That is one receiver for the remote. You can get them with more. You can get them with hands-free devices. So they have like a little finger tab, so you're not carrying the remote. You just hit a tiny button. You can put like on your belt or on your finger or in the palm of your glove, something like that. I will do a separate video on e-collars, so how to use them and things like that. But the important thing to remember is, if you are going to use an e-collar, learn how to use it. Don't assume that it's a magic bullet to just shock the crap out of your dog every time they do something wrong. That is how these tools get misrepresented, and how they get a bad name, and how more people learn to use them incorrectly. So learn how to use an e-collar. Learn from Pat Nolan or somebody that really knows what they're doing. The other thing is, get a reliable brand. Dogtra is very good. I think Garmin even makes them. I don't know for sure if they make only GPS ones, but Easy Educator is another one that I've seen a lot of. I would not get the cheapest thing that you can find at PetSmart. Simply put, you are using this tool to build reliability and distance with your dog, with your dog's obedience. So you need something that is going to hold up to being beat up, getting wet, getting knocked around, and you need it to work every single time. So that's my summary on different types of collars. Stay tuned. Until next time, remain diligent.